think with that, we will hand it over to Casey for his presentation. And as a reminder, you can put your questions in the YouTube chat throughout. So over to you, Casey.
All right, can you hear me? All right. So today I am presenting to everyone for my story about why Chicago is losing the war on rats. And just move something around real quick. First I thought it'd be, I'd kind of start things off talking a little bit about rats, because, I spent months working on this project and I learned so much about rats. Something I think that is that rats, they don't carry rabies. It's a falsehood. Scientists have mapped the genome of lab rats, but they know relatively little about the urban rat, which I think is really interesting, considering that, these are the things that everyone has to deal with all the time. But I guess, the urban rat isn't making people money, and the lab rat is making people a lot of money. Do with that as you will. Due to the rapid sexual maturity of rats, 2 rats left alone and in the right conditions can turn into thousands of rats during the course of a year, which is disgusting. But it's a reason why, people have to be vigilant, because, rats can very, very quickly become a problem that, gets out of control. And rat diseases such as leptospirosis are carried through rat waste, such as feces and urine. And a lot of people, think that, they're going to get these diseases by a rat if they get bitten, but it's actually pretty rare that people suffer rat bites. I have a video, and just to let everyone know that nothing actually bad happens to the rats in this video, but before our story published, I watched this video like 15 times, and I just can't stop looking at it. So the rats are okay, but it's just a funny video, and I like to kind of break things up. People might be wondering, of all the things you could write about, Casey, why are you writing about rats? And I'm a general assignment reporter, so I write about all kinds of stuff. I've written about drugs, I've written about police shootings, I've written about politicians, so on and so forth. But rats, I think, for a lot of people, they touch a nerve. And if you live in the city long enough, you'll just have an interaction with rats. And, rats are vectors of disease. I mentioned leptospirosis, which can be fatal to dogs, and, other diseases. Very famously, the fleas that rats carried around Europe were responsible for the bubonic plague, which killed up to 50 million people. And, as I mentioned earlier, everyone has a rat story. A couple weeks before I published, I actually found a dead one in my basement. And I was joking to friends that the rats are onto me and they're trying to send me a message. And then, maybe about a month or two before that, a rat ran over my friend's foot in our parking lot. Thankfully, she wasn't wearing open-toed shoes. Rats gross people out. One of my people in my building, I was talking to him a little while ago, and he wrote a message to the building and was like, rats would be kind of cute if they weren't so disgusting, which is something I keep in mind. Chicago keeps pretty good, rat data on hand, or at least they produce records about when people call in and they want the city to come out and put some poison down because they see rats in their alley. The city keeps that, and it's something you can ask for. And then, me personally, I just started seeing more of them around my house. And And I just thought to myself, every city service in Chicago has gotten worse since the beginning of the pandemic. I wonder what's happening with rats. And finally, there'd been some stories here and there, but most news coverage I thought had been fairly superficial. No offense to anyone who's worked on these stories or anything like that, but I just thought that they touched the surface about what was really happening. They might talk to the city official in charge of it, but no one had really asked the question, what is it like to live with rats? Who lives with rats and why? And those were the kind of questions that animated me going forward. So for the story, I did some, before I really started, I just did some, kind of pre-reporting, and I sent records requests to 411 for their data about rat complaints. And I sent the same request to streets and sanitation because they keep different data. And I just thought that, it might be interesting to see what they could provide to me and how I could use that. And that's just a good rule in general. If you're asking for data, try to ask for the same sets of data from different places that might hold it, because they might hold different things. And one might produce it to you faster than the other, even if they produce the same thing. And I also very early on, I spoke to a resident wildlife disease ecologist at the Lincolnburg Zoo, just to get a better understanding of city rats. And those facts I gave you earlier were from that question, from that interview, which was fairly delightful. She said some things that I thought were very interesting. I mean, she mentioned how they're working on a study now. It's not out yet, but the study shows that residents in the west side of the city are more likely to on the west side and the south sides of the city are more likely to have rats in their houses or rat waste in their houses, but are less likely to call the city to get help than residents in the north side, which isn't, I guess, entirely surprising, but it just kind of spoke to something, kind of interesting that, we got after a little bit in our story. These are kind of our main takeaways. And this right here is the picture is of a homemade rat trap that these people who live maybe a couple blocks away from me had built. And it's like the rats had just kind of like, they are just at war with the rats, and the rats are, they're just like living it up in their backyard, and the rats like ate underneath the patio and kind of collapsed their back patio. They chewed at the wooden posts outside their house, and destroyed their finely manicured garden. And so they had just went in all these different directions to kill the rats. And as from early spring to the end of July, they killed about 45 in their backyard, using traps like this, with this like homemade Deadpool that they have here. But our findings are that, there's kind of more complaints than ever before. And I'll get to that in a minute. There's also big delays in the median response time for rat complaints. There's loopholes in the permitting process. So in the city of Chicago, largely due to what happened at Wrigley Field years ago, if you demolish a building, you have to have a rat person come out first and search the place for rats and testify that they put some traps down, they look for rats, this is what they found, so on and so forth. But for building permits, they don't necessarily have to do that, only demolition permits. Building permits require you to do rat abatement, but they don't require you to have shown that you've done it before you get the permit, right? So for example, a spring factory, which is two doors down from me, basically, they're renovating it right now, and it is an old building, and it's backed up by an alley with a bunch of garbage in it. And it's one of those things where they just started work on it, and they got the permit without having to show that there are any rats there. So they started doing demolition, and then everyone in the neighborhood started seeing a lot more rats. You hear a lot about specifically generally with police about the staffing is down in the police department. And what I found is that the staffing is actually down in the streets and sanitation's Bureau of Rodent Control by 25%. And that staffing is lower than the decreases in the police department. And with fewer people, you get fewer things done. We found that the city services are slower in the south and west side neighborhoods, that most people don't pay their rat related tickets. And I'll really get into this later on, because there are some people who are, people who have racked up enormous bills that just their kind of response to it is just to not, pay anything at all. They don't really care. And that the city's rat abatement program limits 40% of the city's housing stock. So basically, like, they will come out and they'll put poison, in your backyard or front yard if you see rat holes, right? But they only do that for buildings with 4 units or less. Anything more than 4 units, you have to take care of privately, right? And I did the math on it, and that's about 40% of the city's housing stock, which is ineligible for the service. And the service is also for the 60% that is available to the service. You have to schedule it Monday through Friday between 7 and 9 a.m., right? And those hours just don't work for a lot of people. Some animated rats, moving around. So the data that we received from the city, it's interesting because the streets and sanitation data included the text of the complaints. So if I called in and I said, hey, there are rats the size of cats, in my alley, come out immediately, that text was included with the streets and sanitation data. And so we decided to use that and, build a map so that people could search for all the rat complaints on their block. And you could see it here. I just did Wrigley Field. So you see those numbers there. There's like, the 14, a few blocks north of the field, or a block or half block north of the field. And that's a place where 14 complaints were made, probably by the same person, but that's what happened. And this kind of helped us round out our story because we could just kind of take anecdotal evidence from it and mention in the story, or kind of use it like, we talked about the phenomenon of rats eating through people's wires in their cars. And I just, did a search for car and wire or something like that, and identified at least 38, and I'm sure there were more than that, of just people who had, car wires, and they're just destroyed by rats. We also, even in our story, we mentioned this woman whose Bernedoodle puppy, Georgia, had died after contracting leptospirosis from rats in their backyard, and they called the city multiple times to take care of it, and nothing worked. And Georgia, the dog, died. And I was able to find that complaint, go to the house, and then just kind of do a reverse search, and I was able to find the people. And so in order to make it public, we wanted to make it just a little more private than kind of what it was. So what we did was we anonymized the blocks using some R code. So 3742 North Sheffield became 3700 North Sheffield, and that shows all the complaints that are made on that block at those individual addresses. I found some code that identified and then changed phone numbers to XXXXXXX. And then we geocoded the addresses using the Google API, which cost a little bit of money, but we could afford it as a news organization. And if I did it over again, I think I would try maybe getting the lats and longs maybe from the one of the other city departments. As I mentioned, it's the thing is filled with interesting anecdotes. And here's some of them that I thought were, notable. A rat killed my full-grown cat. There's a rat party going on every night the size of cats. The east end where the dumpsters are, and the west end where the dumpsters are, it's all horrible. Cannot go out of the building in the alley at all. So dangerous. We didn't actually get this one in our story, but it made me laugh. It doesn't mention a rat in it, but it was filed as a rat complaint. This yard is truly one of the most heinous, godforsaken places in this area. A swampy soup of unclean dog and pig shed in the front yard, more poop, an unclean filthy pool, general trash, and detritus scattered through the lot. Launch it into the sun. Which I think if you're a Chicago resident, eventually you've run into a place like that. And then kind of sadly, we got one near the end where, a guy says his mom, who's 76, is being attacked in her house by giant rats. They eat her toes at night, she told me. And she was talking to her on the phone, and a rat was trying to jump on her face. So it's like, these are anecdotes that are funny and they're sad. And they just tell interesting stories about the experiences that people have with rats in their lives in the city of Chicago. And that's something we really wanted to keep the main focus, along with, what is the city doing about it and what does the problem actually look like? And as you can see here, some of our data going back to 2010 shows rat complaints over time. And there's a big spike, obviously when the pandemic started going through 2022. The counter is that more people were home, and that's true. And so they see more rats, the rats come closer to them. They see more rats, and that's true. But, one of the things that we showed is that, while that's true, while there are more complaints, there's also significant issues with how, and the time it takes for the city to respond to these complaints. And so after, what we did was we used shape files and we sorted the addresses into neighborhoods using R's, like one of the geocoding R functions, so that each complaint would just sort into a neighborhood. And then what we did was we subtracted from the date that the complaint was initialized to the date that it was closed for each year in each neighborhood. And then we sorted it so that it was all, from top to bottom or bottom to top, doesn't matter. And then we put a median on each neighborhood for each year. So we could see the amount of days that it took to respond to complaints. And in the city of Chicago, the goal is 5 days to respond to complaints. So that's something that we kind of got after. And it's one of those things where it's like, I think it's important to, when you're reporting something to, make people kind of play by their own rule book, right? And if their own rule book says we need to respond to these complaints within 5 days, the question is, how come you're not doing that, right? And so you could see here, this is a list by year. 2021 was especially bad. That just shows how long it was taking for these rat complaints to respond. In West Lawn, it was 18 days. Clearing was 14 days. Clearing was 14 days. Now in clearing and over in kind of the Madigan world out there, it was just a big problem. And so using that data, what we were able to do is I went out to clearing a couple times, and I was talking to people. We didn't put in the story, but I talked to a guy who was talking about shooting him with his BB gun at night. But we talked to the alderman's office, and I guess they have like a dry ice program out there. And so we went out and we watched them kind of put some dry ice in rat holes. We got really good art from it. We talked to a guy there who had one of the more amazing Chicago accents in my lifetime. I joke that his accent sounds like it was dipped in Italian beef. And so we talked to them about their rat problems and kind of what they think is causing their rat problems. And they mentioned how across the border in Bedford Park, there are all these major demolition projects. Well, it turns out the demolition projects there, don't require rat abatement, right? So I called the mayor, and eventually they changed their municipal code to require that for these big projects that they're doing. So hopefully that will, change something. But that gives a good sense of, what we used the data for. Because when we're working on something like this, I find that the data can only take you so far, right? It kind of points you in a direction, but then you have to take it to the next step and, ask questions and go out and kind of poke it, right? And so then in the corner, you could see here, with the with the response rate looks like the median response rate overall by year in the city. You see that it peaked in 2021 with 9 days, 22, 8 days. This year, I don't really count because we're still in the hot season where there's a bunch of rats and there's a bunch of rat complaints. So it's unreliable, so we couldn't really do anything with it. As I mentioned here, my editor, I talked it through with him, but he wanted me to use the average, but and the average actually made the city look worse. But it was one of those things where there were just a couple cases where like a complaint was opened, and then for whatever reason it was just closed like 9 months later or whatever, and it just skewed things a little bit more than they should. So median was good to use in the situation. And then for my my favorite part is we looked at enforcement, right? But I think that's important. That's part of government accountability, is how does the city get after it, right? Like, outside of the city service where, they come out and kill the rats, like, what about the people who just like don't care and are just doing all these things to increase the rat population? And so I was just kind of looking around, and on their old website I noticed that there was something called rat stoppage tickets. Right, it was on the website, and I was like, oh, what's that? What's a rat stoppage ticket? So I asked the city for copies of the rat stoppage tickets, or data showing the rat stoppage tickets, and the FOIA officer said that they don't do those anymore, and instead they have sanitation violations. I'm like, oh, okay. So it's and they mentioned here sanitations which allow exterior building conditions that contribute to rodent conditions, blah 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 blah. So instead, what I did was I asked the city for their sanitation violations to just to get a sense of what even those look like. And so I asked this data from streets and sanitation, and but unlike a lot of tickets, it didn't include names of people ticketed, dollar figures, etc. And so you could see here, this is just like a sample of some of the data that the streets and sanitation supplied to me. And it does show some stuff that's interesting, like it shows the address, it shows the municipal code violation that triggered this thing, the docket numbers, so you could look up the case. You could actually find pictures of the different violations online, the ward, the district, the disposition, and the beat. But this doesn't show me who's getting ticketed, and I think that's really important. You could to see who, I feel like if you could identify who the city is trying to get after, that could tell you a lot about the city's priorities, or what they're looking at, or who the city is in direct conflict with. So from my experience writing about bike lane tickets, I found that the finance department keeps really good records on tickets. Like, they're the ones in charge of it, and they keep pretty good data on it. So I got that from them. And when I emailed them and I asked them for these sanitation tickets, I said, we can't do that, but what are the violation codes, or what are the codes? And so what I did was I found the violation codes that the street and sanitation supplied to me for what they considered sanitation tickets. I copied all the codes. I cleaned them up, and I put them in a CSV, and then I shot them over to the finance department. And you can see here, it's much more detailed. Like, this right here lists the docket number, the date, the address, but also lists the name of the person that got ticketed. If it's a business, it lists the name of their business, the finding, like what the court determined, and then, kind of most crucially, the original amount that they were ticketed, the current amount owed, and the total that they paid. So you could see how many of these people actually paid these things and what is still outstanding. And so that's a really good place to start. And so to make sense of the data, I used Dedup's Python library to group the offenders by name. And if you haven't used the software, Derek and Forrest, I believe, built it, and it's truly incredible. Like, it's really, really interesting. And again, it's one of these things that with all data, it can point you towards the right direction, but you kind of need to fish it out once you get there. And so what I did was I used it to dedupe the name of the names of the businesses, because there were maybe 180,000 tickets, right? There are 180,000 tickets, and people's names were spelled in a variety of names, in a variety of ways. And so you could see here, the cluster with the most was 796, right? So it looked at all these names and it determined that there is one name that was similar enough 2,079 times. So then I looked at that and I thought to myself, let's dig into this a little bit further and let's just look at what these clusters are. And so you can see right here, and this is another snapshot of my data. It shows what the cluster ID is, so that's 796, right? And then it says Dion LLC, Susie Wilson, Susie B. Wilson, Susie Wilson with an S, so on and so on and so forth. And then I kind of thought to myself, oh, this is really interesting. And I just had many questions. Who is Susie B. Wilson? What are these companies doing? And after Googling Susie B. Wilson, I found a tweet that Susie Baba Wilson put on Twitter. And it only had one tweet: appeals court refuses to kill Chicago's weed law. And I thought to myself, what's that? And so I searched from it, and there's actually an online opinion that's online from famed federal appellate court judge Richard Posner. And Posner was famous for one, just doing a lot of research on stuff. Like, he would just get into things and would send his law clerks to learn more about it or go to the places and do additional research. He kind of prized himself on that, and also just seemed to just he really enjoyed writing, I guess, because I read this opinion, which I thought was scathing and also hilarious. And there's two things that I thought were kind of interesting. And one is that he kind of gets after this thing that I was very much interested in, is who is this person, right? And this is a person who their company filed a lawsuit claiming that the city of Chicago was violating their constitutional rights for fining it for failing to cut the weeds on the properties. And what the judge found is that not even the case is that there's no information about the company except that it's incorporated in Illinois and its address is in Skokie, which is separate from Chicago. Virtually all we've been able to learn about the company is that it owns real estate in Chicago. Discount Inn does not have a website or Dun & Bradstreet report or more than a tiny handful of internet references, none of which describes its business. The address in Skokie is a private home in suburban subdivision. The home is owned by a person named Baba Abdul Jabbar, who has no website. And the property apparently is the headquarters not only of Discount Inn, but also of Solo Land Cup and SNS General Corp., which do not have websites. And it seems that, quote, a Susie Baba, end quote, is a president of at least 4 of the corporations of that address. So I thought that was kind of interesting. So you just usually don't see, judges do stuff like that. And also just get after this very important question that I had, who is this person? And so, the other thing he wrote that was really funny is that basically he's like, this person's claim that the free speech clause insulates all weeds from public control is ridiculous. It's not as if the plaintiff invented, planted, nurtured, dyed, clipped, or has otherwise beautified its weeds, or that it exhibits or intends to or aspires to exhibit them in museums or flower shows. Its weeds have no expressive dimension. The plaintiff just doesn't want to be bothered with having to have them clipped. Which is kind of a fire emoji for a legal opinion. Its weeds have no expressive dimension. And so after doing the work, I found that it wasn't just one company that owed this money; it was 30 companies, and these 30 companies have I forget the total number of tickets, but these companies have 4,000, more than that, tickets, but they owe the city of Chicago more than $15 million. And they owe them, as you can see here, it's not even primarily, it's the south and west sides and the poorer regions of the south and west sides. And so you can see here more than half of the money is owed due to lots in Inglewood, which I thought was really interesting. And what we did here was we had these addresses, and we sorted them to shape files of the different neighborhoods, so we could determine how much the companies owed in which places. And again, it's like you always have to check the stuff, because looking at it, a second time, I saw that there was an address that was mistakenly sorting to the loop. And I looked at the address, and it's in the west side. So we had to clip that from there. But it's a very Chicago story. It's a very, very Chicago story about, this North suburban woman who owns, who owes the city a ton of money on these lots that they're not keeping up. And, for a story like this, you always need to speak with the person, right? And I find in my experience that calling people on the phone for stuff like this is just not the way to go. If the person, especially if they're not a politician, right? If they're not a politician and they're a person, who's going to hang up the phone on you before you can get anywhere, you have to try to talk to them in person. I also find, for sensitive cases, it's really important to talk to the people directly, because when you call someone on the phone, I think it just doesn't work as well. You can kind of read people's body language in person. So we needed to speak with her, and eventually I tracked down her home and where she lives. And so we went to her house in Northbrook, Illinois, which you could see right here. The real estate listing says it's an 8,000 square foot house with heated wood and marble floors. So we went to her house, and she was not happy to see us. And this is a story. It's one of these things where we kind of talked about it, like, should we use it? Should we not use it? But we eventually said yes, because she is referenced in this lawsuit that she filed against the city of Chicago, claiming that the city had no right to, issue her tickets. And furthermore, a judge mentioned her by name in this lawsuit. And due to the amount of money that this person owed to the city and her, kind of quasi status, she also donated to politicians, and the politicians could not explain to us what she did for a living, despite taking money from her. We decided that that taking a photo was the path forward. And also, I also think that this is a person who has 30 LLCs and has managed to kind of evade some of the spotlight despite owing $15 million. So. And as I mentioned before, it's important. I find it's important to reach the people you are writing about, for the story, because I think the photo that my partner Mina Bloom of Block Club took is really, just kind of says a lot. It captures a good look on her face. People can see that, and they can, people identify with pictures of other people, right? And if we didn't have this, and we didn't have a photo of the house that she lives in, I think some of the impact of the story would be blunted. And so something like this is important to get at. And afterwards, I tried calling her again. I said, look, I was at her house the other day, and I'm sorry to alarm you, but I was hoping to talk to you about this, and I got hung up on. And then later that day, I got a call from her attorney, who was like, please stop contacting my client, so on and so forth. And then the next day I followed up with the attorney, and I asked if, any interest in issuing a statement. And the response I got was, no statement, don't use my client's name or photograph. And then we followed up another time, and we essentially sent all the questions we had about it just so that I guess they had it, and you can't say that you were surprised or caught off guard when we went out of our way again and again and again and again to talk to this person. And again, I think it's a very important thing, and I think a lot of it's just an important thing to do. I feel like phones can only do so much, and just showing up, sometimes just showing up to people's houses can really unlock different doors. And so I'm gonna, I guess I'm ending a little bit early, but I'll turn it over to questions. You could see here, and maybe I could share afterwards. I have the data from the story up on my GitHub, which is mostly inactive, but I decided to put it up there. So if people wanted to do something about it, they can. Our website, or with our links to our stories, are all also here. I didn't really get into it, but another thing I found was when I looked at these tickets, I saw that the city had actually fined the Cook County Land Bank Authority and CPS and a couple other different agencies for creating rat-like conditions. So it's one of those things where I kind of looked at that too by looking at this data, and I found like there was a housing complex up in Rogers Park where it was a public housing complex, and there were 20 rat holes in the backyard. The rat holes were reported in May. And so I went to one of the hearings, and the judge was kind of mad about it. I was like, in late June, the judge was like, what is taking so long to fill these rat holes? So then I contacted the CHA in like July, and I asked them what's going on, and they're like, oh, we finally got around to doing it on July 15th. So basically 2 months after somebody reported that there were 20 rat holes in the property, Chicago Housing Authority finally gets around to filling them. So you can do with that what you will. But just another story where I was able to just kind of look at the data and just kind of pull something else out of it. I'm on Twitter, which is going down the tubes. That's the toner. I should have put my blue sky up there, but I haven't done that. I have the blue sky, but I haven't really tweeted. I'm not active in that space yet. And then my email at ctoner@bettergov.org if anyone has any additional questions about this. I'm gonna try to turn this back over to the people.
Yeah. Thank you so much. This was fascinating. And really helpful, especially hear that connection between the data and then how does that inform kind of the storytelling. So we do have some audience questions. The first question was, while you were talking about the rat abatement services, I think the question was trying to get at why are they so limited, like the 7 to 9 a.m. and the excluding multifamily properties. Do you know if that's common in other cities, or why the services are so limited? You mentioned staffing being cut.
Yeah, I think it's I don't have a direct answer, and I should I should also say that the city of Chicago was not playing ball at all in this project, and to the point where, just from my granted subjective opinion, I felt if they would have sat down and explained to me a little bit more about their services and some of the problems they're seeing, that might have helped them to some extent, but they didn't. They put out a statement that didn't really say too much and addressed really, really minor things, and we sent them all of our questions, including stuff like this, and we didn't get any answer. So if I had to guess, and I thought a lot about this, I think to some extent it is a matter of it's 40% of the housing stock, and people believe, either rightly or wrongly, that these homeowners associations or people that own these buildings can take care of it, right? Which is true to some extent. I live in a building and we paid for it, right? But there's a lot of places with slum landlords, people we talk to for the story, and the slum landlords clearly do not care about rat abatement, right? They're not going to spend the money because that would get in the way of them being, slum landlords. so that's just an issue, right? And it's also, there's just there's a lot of like large apartment buildings. And then the other side of that that I wanted to address, the other part of that question is like the limited hours, like 7 to 9 a.m. Like the Bureau of Rodent Control, like they start early and they also end early. Like I forget exactly what it was, but they begin at 6 and end at 2 or 3 or something like that. So they start really early to begin with. And also, again, just they've lost a quarter of their staff and they're down with everything. So if I had to hazard to guess, which is what I'm doing now, that's what I would say it is. And again, we gave them every opportunity to get back to us with answers with some of the stuff, and the city was just they just took more of like an antagonistic standpoint on this.
Oh, well, thank you for hazarding the guess. So this being the Shy Hackney audience, we have a lot of questions about the data aspects. So one of them is, was any of the data that you used available from the city data portal, or did you have to like request or FOIA all of it?
I requested and FOIA'd all of it. I think I used, I'm a little bit hazy on it because I think I used, because the map that we built contains data from what streets and sanitation supplied to me, because it uses the complaints that people actually made, right? None of that stuff is on the online portal, right? But for a map, that's what we used, and I think it's just interesting. But for some of the other things, like I did pull, I think for that part of the story that includes like the graph that shows the number of complaints over time, I use that from the data portal because their data just goes back further than what I had. So it's kind of a mix and match of both. But for the heart of it, for looking at what's happened since the pandemic, all that's from the Department of Streets and Sanitation. And they also included more stuff in there about what people fill out, like after they go to a complaint. Like there's different like fields they fill out, but to be honest, none of it was really kind of clear or concrete. And I didn't get the sense that it's necessarily they use it for much of anything. And one other thing I forgot to mention also, that the city of Chicago's Inspector General's office is auditing the Bureau of Rodent Control. So we should know more a little bit later. And also I'm working on a follow-up now where I'm looking at some of the things that the city has kind of gotten involved in, with Our Lady from Northbrook. So more is on the way.
Yeah. I guess we'll all stay tuned. And someone else asked, could you talk about your FOIA process with different departments in the city?
Okay. Constant, I think whenever I work on any project, I'm always just like, punching the send button and then, seeing what comes back. And again, it was like, I felt like with streets and sanitation, things were kind of combative, like I was constantly just going back and forth on stuff they didn't have, stuff they did have. As in my mention, what I said earlier, I got that main data from the streets and sanitation, but then I asked for them, I asked them for these rat stoppage tickets, and the data they sent back was incomplete, right? So then I asked the finance department for their data, and then they got it back. They, got stuff back to me. And then when I figured out the story about the woman whose companies owe $15 million, what I did at that point was I repeated the same request and I just made it longer, because the city of Chicago told me that they had known about this woman for several decades. So I thought to myself, she probably owes more than just the amount that she owes since 2019, right? And so it more than doubled when I asked for that same information, back more years. So again, with any of these projects, it's like if I learn something or I see something that's kind of interesting, I just begin asking for the data. I also asked for their salary data because I was interested in seeing who these people were. I was also interested in seeing how many people had left the department. so I could look at attrition, right? Because that can kind of explain things. And I also had mixed success with calling people who'd left the department and kind of picking their brain about how things work. And that's how I basically figured out how the program works. Is I talked to people who used to work there who told me, because the city was just refused to answer like basic questions about what it is that they do. And so I'm always pulling stuff, and that's kind of how it was in this project. I just get a little bit of string, and then I keep on pulling the string, and then when I reach a stopping point, I put another request to get more string.
Yeah, and so I guess following up on the woman who owes so much money, like, what is the enforcement? Like, does the city try, especially if they've been aware of it, like what would the consequences even be? Or like are they trying to collect that money? Like, I'm just curious how you can owe that much money. I think especially we've had presentations at Hack Night, right, about the water bills, right, and people getting sent to collections about money that they owe the city. And then there's these, something like this where there's so much money, like how has it not been collected, I guess.
Well, clearly this is like a strategy that this person uses. There are these properties are owned by 30 LLCs that are registered to the same PO box in Glenview, right? And it's a pattern, right? What's happening is a pattern. It's been ongoing, and this person doesn't seem like they have much interest in paying anything on it. And again, they tried to sue to stop them from getting fined at all, right? This is what's happening. And so the city from what I understand, the city has some legal remedies where they could try to get the properties back. They could put liens on the properties. And I'm working on I don't want to spoil it here, but I'm working on a follow-up now kind of about what's happening in one of these cases since our story published. And the efforts to get some of that money back. The thing that kind of came to my mind was like, you could probably, you could maybe file a lawsuit, right, and see where that goes. And I talked to some attorneys about it, and the attorneys said basically, in order to win one of these lawsuits, you have to pierce the LLC. The LLCs make stuff like this it makes it very difficult to go after people individually. But you pierce the LLC, and you have to prove that it's like one person, right? It's not really a company. It's just one person. Granted, there is just like all 30 LLCs are registered to one person, right? And it's outside of one where this person's mother is listed as the secretary. It's this person, right? Granted, there could be like silent owners who aren't really involved, so on and so forth. But those are some of the remedies that the city of Chicago is dealing with it. And again, I'm working on something where I'm trying to, kind of crack that open a little bit more. Because this story about this lady, it did better for us than the actual story about the rats did. So there's some interest in it.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we're heading into budget season, right? So people are curious. Okay, I think maybe one last question would be just like, if someone is dealing with rat infestation problems, like what's your impression of what they should do, like based on what you learned during all of this?
And I can speak to this personally, just not as a reporter, but personally, because I mentioned that a couple weeks before I ran our story, I found a dead one in my basement, right? And that was just like a full-blown panic, like, oh gosh, this is nasty. Now I have these things in my basement. And so one of the things I noticed when I was looking around, I kept on seeing them all over the place, is that there were little holes in the corners of the lid to my dumpster that either rats had chewed through or the squirrels had chewed through. Almost imperceptible holes, because it just looks like it's part of the lid, right? But when I looked at it closer, I saw that there were like little teeth marks on it. So I called Waste Management, and I called them and said, hey, we need a lid because the squirrels have chewed through it or the rats have, and they're big problems right now. And they came out and they fixed the lid. And since then, I haven't seen rats around the house, right? So rats, things that they're attracted to are food and water and shelter, right? And if you remove the food and the water from them, they'll find shelter somewhere. But if you remove the food and the water, they will go somewhere else where they have it. They're smart creatures, and they've been around longer than we have.
Okay. And one very last question is, would you be able to share your slides?
Yeah, how do I go about doing this?
Yeah. I think maybe if you send them to us, we could post them in the Shy Hack Night Slack at least.
Yeah, I'll
Um,
send that. I'll send that right now. And thank you everyone for listening to me. This has been fun.
yeah. Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, as that request shows, that people were really, really interested in, glad to learn more about this reporting. So I think with that, we will call it. Josh, I don't know if we want to pull up the slide and just invite folks to join our post-presentation Zoom call right now, and bit.ly/chn-remote-zoom. And we traditionally end with our catchphrase, go